Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and yet another update with significant developments. We have a new Russian offensive in the direction of Bakhmut, a Russian counterattack in the direction of Novomikhailivka, a Russian foothold in Zinkivka, here to the north of Kupiansk, and further advancements by the Russians in Avdiivka. We start out in the direction of Novomikhailivka, where the Russians not just won against the Ukrainian counterattack, but launched their own new attack, where they managed to regain some of the positions here in the southeast of the town, and also launch operations to the south of the town. So with this, we are seeing that the Russians are expanding the areas of which they are attacking from, and this is actually a very interesting development, because it clearly shows that the Russian strategy has changed. Before this, we saw that the Russians were simply attacking on the flanks, trying to expand the front assaults, and then simply just attacking head on. But now the Russians are attacking from all sides all the time. They're constantly attacking from new directions, which keeps the Ukrainian defenders on the move and trying to guess where the Russians will attack from next. So the Russians are much more volatile, they're much more unpredictable, and with this we're seeing that they're actually having success. Compared to before, where the Ukrainians would simply have pushed them out of Novomikhailivka like they did to the south, the Russians are now holding on to their positions within the town and fighting back and managing to advance yet again with these new advancements. So with this, we see that the Russians are continuously pressuring the Ukrainian forces here, and it is difficult to see how this battle would turn out, because as I mentioned in my previous video, following the Ukrainian counterattack, which the Russians managed to hold back against and resist against keeping their foothold within the town, they would send additional forces and start their own attack again, and yet here we see that they've managed to advance yet again from two directions, and we may even see further advancements from the north again after the previous attempt. However, it could also not happen if what happened in the north was a failure. They could simply switch to the southern direction and keep their focus here. So what we're seeing is that there's continuous fighting over Novomikhailivka, where the Russians are using new tactics. We then move on to the Avdiivka direction, where we see continuous fighting in all of the directions in the north, both to the east of the lake, but also to the west within the center of the city, where continuous fighting is taking place, and the Russians have made yet another small advancement to the west. They are inching closer and closer to the main supply route in and out of Avdiivka from the north, the only paved road in and out of Avdiivka, as he captured further parts of the Dacha area here to the southeast of the coke plant, as well as the bus station area. So they are moving closer and the fighting is taking place there right now. So with this, we see that this battle over this bus station right here is going to determine whether or not the Russians will be able to cut off physically the supply line in and out of Avdiivka from the north, leaving only this road here between the citadel area to Sheverne as the only one in and out, which is not paved. So with this, we see that there's significant pressure by the Russians on the Ukrainian supply route in and out of the city, which could threaten this would be a semi-encirclement, and cutting off this road would be a complete encirclement of the city. So it is a complete repeat of the Bakhmut scenario, where the Russians are simply just completely cutting off the supply lines and then storming the city from all directions, trying to get better positioning and drain out the Ukrainian forces, since they would be running very low on supplies and it's difficult for them to receive manpower, reinforcements, and so on. The Ukrainians would launch counterattacks, but that would put the Russians on the defensive, which would allow them to get an advantage, and it would just simply drain the Ukrainian forces fighting by the city over the city. So with this, we see that there is significant developments, and the Russians are getting very close to semi-encircling the city, just a few hundred meters, and the city would be semi-encircled, and we would enter the end game of Avdiivka. We then move on to the next part of the front line, which is the section around Bakhmut, where we have this breakthrough by the Russians. They managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses here by the cemetery area to the west of Romove. And with this, we see that the Russians captured the forest line here to the southeast of Bohdanivka, the cemetery itself, and this forest patch to the southwest of Romove. And with this, we see that the Russians have broken through the Ukrainian defenses, which had held back the Russians for a long time. And the main reason for this was given by the Russians fighting in this direction. And that is that there was one rotation that took place here in the Bakhmut direction. This replaced both the commander, but also the units themselves fighting in this section of the front line. The rotation was carried out, and the new soldiers fighting here in the Bakhmut direction is the 98th Guards Air Assault Division. This division is not just any division, it is one of the elite Russian soldiers. The division was fighting the Battle of Kiev in the north at the very start of the invasion, and they held back the Ukrainian summer offensive in the Zaporizhia front. So this division rotated to the Bakhmut section of the front line and started this offensive operation. So with this, we see that there are now elite units by the Russians fighting in this section of the front line, and the first day of offensive operations, they managed to get a breakthrough. Now we'll have to see if this will be a trend going forward, where they can start launching attacks towards Ivanivsk, considering they've gotten rid of the main defensive position of the Ukrainians to the north of the village, or if they'll continue in a western direction towards Chesev Yar, get control of Bohdanivka, and so on. But we can expect there will be significant developments here in this section of the front line, considering that the elite Russian unit has been rotated here, and the Russians would be in a advantageous position, because there is something very important to note, is the fact that some Ukrainian units have not rotated not even once since the very start of the Russian invasion. So almost 2 years without a single rotation means that they are completely exhausted. This was the same case for some of the Russian units fighting until the end of the Ukrainian summer offensive. At that point, the Russians had enough troops and a secure enough situation to rotate some of these exhausted units to the rear for a long period of time of 2 to 3 months and then back in again. So with this, the current situation is that the most experienced Russian units who had been fighting for over a year, almost 2 years, have now received a rotation and are back on the front line, while the Ukrainians are completely exhausted. This is one of the points that Zelensky said as soon as he fired Zaluzhny, that is one thing that he wants to improve. That is one of the goals with the rotation in the Ukrainian military command. That is, they want to improve the rotation of Ukrainian units, because some units have not rotated not even once. So with this, we see that there are completely exhausted elite Ukrainian units, while completely refreshed Russian units who recently rotated after fighting for a long time, and that is just something that is incomparable. The Ukrainians would have a significant disadvantage if these two units clashed, and therefore we're seeing that, for example, the 98th Air Defense Division is going to show a lot of developments at the front line because they have just been rotated. The final significant development in this update is this in Sinkivka. Now, the Sinkivka direction is somewhat different from the Bakhmut direction. In the Bakhmut direction, there was a significant development due to the rotation of units. The elite Russian units who had just been on rotation after fighting for a long time with heaps of combat experience are now fighting at the front line. In the Sinkivka direction, it is the exact same units. The difference is in the command. So the Russians realized that the generals who were fighting and commanding in this section of the front line were utterly incompetent. Just like I said in a previous video where I called out their cruel strategy, which was pretty much useless. In that video, I watched a video of a Russian assault on the village of Sinkivka, where they launched a armored assault here in the north of the village, where they simply drove in, dropped off a couple dozen soldiers, and then left again. This was a completely idiotic tactic, and I called them out on that. They simply left their soldiers to die. Now, instead, the new commanders who are in charge of the Sinkivka direction moved through the forest area, got some footholds here to the west of the village, used the cover of the forest lines to launch assault groups into the village, and suddenly with an armored assault, they gained control over 20% of the village and the northern flank of it. So with this, the Russians now have control over the north of Sinkivka with just a simple switch up in command. This was reported on by Russian soldiers fighting in this section of the front line, and it was confirmed by Remy Lind. And I quote, "According to Sinkivka, it turns out that the two commanders who were doing crazy things with head-on attacks were removed. Now they installed normal ones, and things immediately went ahead and began to attack as they should have done before through the forest. and immediately there is results. As I wrote yesterday, about 20% under Russian control. So with this, we see that there is a significant development in Sikivka simply due to the removal of idiotic commanders who I called out. And people were saying, oh, armchair YouTuber generals calling out real generals' pure performance like it is a joke. But in reality, well, you're the joke. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.